the God of physical violence. There's only one thing more distressing than the violence in the Old Testament. That is when Christians refuse to talk about it. You click on a video only hoping for some kind of answers, only for Christians to ignore the issue altogether. Let's face it, the way most Christians, like me, address the violence of the Old Testament is to ignore it. Perhaps because we Christians are too embarrassed, or perhaps because we prefer that these parts of the Bible weren't there. If you'd prefer not to face the reality of violence in the Old Testament, turn away. I'll be trying to face the issue as honestly and as transparently as I can. But if you'd like to begin to try and make sense of it all, then listen on. So we're going to look at 6 questions. Why, who, how, when, what, and where. So first question, why? Why do we find violence in the Old Testament so distressing? Well, witnessing violence is always distressing. If we see violence on the news or watch it in a war film, we flinch and we want to turn away. Violence is always an unwanted intruder in the world that we live in. That's why the first mention of violence in the Bible is disapproving. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. These words in Genesis chapter 6 remind us that God is grieved by violence just as much as we are. And if the Bible stopped there, then none of us would have any problem. What distresses us is the kind of thing that we read next. Following on from those verses, so God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence. Because of them, I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. The God who is so grieved by violence then goes on to use violence. That's what we find so distressing. We've learnt to accept violence on the news because it's consistent with living in a world full of sinful people. We've learnt to accept violence in war films because the theme of violence is consistent with the theme of war. But the reason we find biblical violence so distressing is because it seems so inconsistent with the character of God. Isn't God loving? Doesn't he hate violence? Is God consistent in his character, or is he not? When a parent is inconsistent in their discipline of the child doesn't know what to do with themselves. They could be offered sweets one minute and then be the victim of a violent outburst the next. When a boss is inconsistent in their actions, the staff don't know how to relate to them. The boss could be their best friend one minute, then make their life hell a minute later. So, if God is inconsistent in the way he judges human beings, then we're going to be like that child and live in fear. Will God love and accept me? Or should I be nervous in his presence in case he decides to smite me when my back is turned? On the other extreme, if God is consistently portrayed as a violent monster, then like any employee, we'll want to go looking for another boss. So is God consistent or inconsistent? And is his consistency good or bad? So, second question, who is the judge? When we witness an adult disciplining a child in the supermarket, we can't help but turn and look. We look, we watch, and then we judge that adult, often jumping to rash conclusions without knowing the context of what they've just done. Is this a spontaneous outburst, or has that child been warned several times before? Did the child only eat a grape, or did they just walk out of the shop with a stolen iPhone? The context of this act of discipline makes a difference to how we interpret it. Part of the context we need to consider is the who of who is doing the discipline. Is the person disciplining the child supermarket staff? They have no right to discipline the child. Whereas if the adult is the child's parent, then within the law they have a right. The God of the Bible is described as the judge of all the earth. This is because he is the one who made it and who gave life to all people. God certainly possesses the authority to judge the world. And it's clearly stated that God's goal in judging the world is justice. So the next question we need to ask is how? How does God judge the world? Does God administer justice well or not? Well, if a child in the supermarket ate a chocolate bar, it would be pretty reasonable for that parent to not give that child a pudding after their next meal. However, if that same parent then didn't feed their child for the entire week, then such a punishment would be excessive. The idea of justice works on the principle that the size of the punishment matches the severity of the crime. Smaller crimes are dealt with through smaller punishments. Larger crimes are dealt with bigger fines and longer prison sentences. To ignore wrongdoing is not just. To punish excessively is not just either. The consistent pattern of the Bible is that God works on this system of proportional judgment, the size of the punishment matching the severity of the crime. And so even though we may not like what we read, there is a consistent pattern throughout. Some examples. Exodus chapter 4. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son." Judges. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Then Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. Revelation chapter 16. You are just in these judgments, O Holy One, for they have shed the blood of your holy people and your prophets, and you have given them blood to drink as they deserve. The consistent pattern of the Bible is that the punishment matches the crime. God works on a system of proportional judgment where the size and type of punishment matches the severity of the crime. That's why God's justice is described in Deuteronomy as perfect. God neither ignores the wrongdoing nor is excessive in the punishment he dishes out. So when does God judge? Now we've all seen a child with parent eating grapes or a banana in the supermarket. But hopefully you've not seen a child with parent walking out with an unpaid 40-inch TV. You've probably also not seen a child eating a tub of banana flavour ice cream in the supermarket. This is because the fruit aisle is the first aisle in the supermarket. And so, though the child may pick up a banana, they are issued a warning and given a second chance. The last aisle in the supermarket, however, is either frozen food or electronics. And by this time, after 10 or more warnings, you'd have hoped that the child would have learned. You do not take that for which you have not paid. In much the same way, biblical judgments consistently follow a period of waiting and warning. God warns, God waits, God warns again. And so most scenes of judgment only come after a time of God giving people the time and information they need to change. In Amos it says, "Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing plans to his servants the prophets." Information always comes before condemnation. God's warning always comes before he judges. In the book of Ezekiel, "Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they will turn from their ways and live. Turn, turn, turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel?" God gives information because he longs for salvation. God waits and warns people because he'd rather people change and be forgiven. I know that it's hard for us to appreciate that when we read numerous chapters in the Bible where the theme of judgment is repeated. However, it's worth noting that what takes us 2 minutes to read may have taken place over 200 years. Many warnings often take place before the judgment happens. This large amount of time, sometimes hundreds of years, is given for the purpose that people would change. We may well ask ourselves, why is there not more judgment in the Bible, not less? It says in the book of Micah, "Who is God like you, who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy." We're near the end now, but what? Sometimes we ask questions when we read of violence in the Bible. Sometimes we just react with, what? Where on earth did that come from? Some examples. In the book of Judges, when Phinehas the priest saw this, when he saw a man and woman committing sexual immorality right in front of Moses' eyes, right after God had warned them that it was wrong. When Phinehas the priest saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. 1 Kings chapter 13, as he went on his way, a lion met him on the road and killed him, and his body was left lying on the road with both the donkey and the lion standing beside it. 2 Kings chapter 2, as Elijah was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. "Get out of here, Baldy," they said. "Get out of here, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. Knives through stomachs, lions pouncing on people, bears mauling people to death. What? Where did these things come from? Where is God's patience and warnings in these situations? Now, if we're all honest, we've probably all stolen something from the supermarket, even if we've never walked out without paying. We might have opened a box to look inside and then left it on the shelf without buying it. We might have knocked over a bottle of wine and quickly hurried around the corner. We might have ruined a good banana by examining it for 5 minutes and then putting it back on the shelf, even though we know it will never be sold. Now, when we walk out of the supermarket, we're probably not going to have handcuffs slapped onto our wrists. We've in one sense stolen, but that stealing isn't a lifestyle choice or a clear act of defiance. However, if a shoplifter walks out of the supermarket with stolen goods, then they possibly will get handcuffs slapped on their wrists. No warnings, no tolerance, no questions asked. Why? Because shoplifting is, for many, a lifestyle choice, a clear act of defiance, a crime done with full awareness that it is illegal. Though it would take a long time to go through every "what, where did that come from" type passage, there is a consistency. Sudden judgment and seemingly severe punishments are only reserved for certain situations and specific individuals. When the sin committed is a clear act of defiance, when the sin is done in full awareness that it is wrong, in such circumstances there is no need for any warning, if the person is already aware and has chosen to do it anyway. And lastly, where is their judgment? There is consistency in all Old Testament judgments. God is always the judge. God always judges justly. God always warns first, unless the people already know. God's desire is always that people would change and seek his forgiveness. But despite this consistency in the Old Testament, we sometimes feel that there's an inconsistency between the Old and the New. God judges people in the Old Testament in ways we might describe as violent, whereas God's judgment seems to be absent in the New. In one sense, this is true. In one sense, it is not. Though judgment might be spoken of and seen within every Old Testament book, judgment in the New Testament is mainly confined to two places. We hear of judgment to some degree in nearly every book, but only in two places in the New Testament do we primarily see it. The second place we see it is at Christ's second coming. When Jesus comes again, God promises that he will judge the world. The first place is at Christ's first coming, when judgment falls on God's one and only Son. The New Testament explains that upon the cross where Jesus died, Jesus was paying the price for our sin. This is because God cannot ignore our sin. Justice demands some form of proportional punishment. But because God's love and desire to forgive is so strong, God was willing to pay the price himself. In one sense, our discomfort with Old Testament violence reflects the character of God. God's desire is not to judge, but that people would turn to him for forgiveness. Those who don't will be judged at Christ's second coming. But for those who do accept this offer, God offers free forgiveness and grace.